Well, we've had a terrific conversation so far, and as I said in my opening comments, I think ultimately what's most important here is to figure out where we're going to go from here. What's the path forward? What are the things that we're actually going to do in order to address what are clearly these longstanding issues? And we are fortunate to have from the book authors literally some of the nation's leading authorities on these issues, and four different ideas that I think give us a lot to think about. So each is going to have the same parameters of the 7 minutes of presentation time, and then we will have, I hope, ample time for some audience dialogue, since we've got a chance to dig in a little bit on some of these proposals. We're going to begin with John Brittain here to my left from your perspective, who's professor of law at the School of Law at the University of District of Columbia. He's written and litigated extensively in this area. John and I don't know each other, but I know his work very well, and I'm very glad that he's here. Sheryll Cashin, who's professor of law at Georgetown University, one of the only people here who didn't contribute to the book, but who has her own a very interesting new book, Place, Not Race, that was featured along with the work by Tony Carnevale and Jeff Stroll in the David Leonhardt piece this morning in the New York Times. We have Tony Carnevale, director at the Center on Education and the Workforce at Georgetown University, a longtime partner of Lumina Foundation. Very glad that Tony can contribute here. And I think we're going to begin with Jessica Howell, who is the executive director of policy research at the College Board. Let's take it away. Jessica?
Thanks, Jamie, and thank you in advance to all of my fellow panelists. I'm sure this is going to be an interesting discussion. A couple of economists, a couple of lawyers. How bad could it possibly get? Am I right? Yeah. So I want to sort of start off the discussion, or at least preface my comments with some clarification. And I want to talk to you briefly about students who fall, all along the academic ability distribution, who appear to make college search, college application, and then college enrollment decisions with less information and more constraints, either real constraints or perceived constraints, than their more affluent peers that have the same academic credentials. They are students who, despite being academically well prepared for a set of colleges with a particular level of rigor and with a particular level of resources, they fail to consider these institutions when they apply, when they explore colleges, when they apply to colleges, and when they enroll to colleges. So Darren, I don't know where Darren got to, but these are the Darren's pre-posse members, right? These are students who, in some areas of the research literature, people refer to as mismatched or undermatched. I know that those are terms that not everybody likes, but because they're utilized in the research literature and in the media, I know that it's useful to refer to them. So in research that we've conducted and that the others conducted using nationally representative data, what we show is that this phenomenon of undermatching is something that does exist among very high-achieving students, and that has received the lion's share of the attention, especially in the media, but it is a phenomenon that we see all along the academic ability distribution. So about 40% of students choose a college that is not particularly well aligned with their own academic credentials, and that's true for the highest achieving students all the way on down to students with much more modest academic credentials. In the context of today's discussion, it's important to note that there are gaps that appear along socioeconomic status lines. So if you look at students who fall in the lower half of the SES distribution, you'll see that a full 50% of them undermatch, compared to students who are in the upper half of the SES distribution, where only 35% undermatch. Okay, so this, even if you don't like the concept and don't think that we should be shooting for perfect alignment between students and colleges, the fact that we see these gaps arising along socioeconomic status lines is something that deserves attention in this conversation. So the research on really indicates that these students who appear not to be taking advantage of the academic opportunities that they've earned does reveal some interesting patterns along the lines of race and ethnicity, which are also relevant to today's conversation. So the Consortium for Chicago Schools Research found that Latino students in the Chicago public school systems were much more likely to undermatch or mismatch, as they said, compared to white students. So 44% of Latinos compared to 36% of white students. In Crossing the Finish Line, which was, at least in this chapter, research utilizing information from North Carolina, the authors found that undermatch was more common among African American high school students, particularly those that were very high achieving, again, relative to white students. And in new analyses in the chapter that I co-edited or co-authored with Alexandria Radford in this edited volume today, we see that among Hispanic SAT takers, they have the highest predicted increase in bachelor's degree completion associated with improving academic match. Okay, so if you hone in on SAT takers with the strongest academic credentials, which admittedly in the conversation around affirmative action and the types of institutions we're talking about today is where the conversation belongs, those students with the strongest academic credentials are predicted to have a 16 percentage point increase in BA completion among Hispanics. And that's twice as large as the predicted increase that we would estimate among white students with the same exact credentials. So this is some incentive for us to give some attention to the concept of match and to recognize that the reason that we see these patterns, particularly among the Latino community, is because that's a group of students who, again, in the data we can see are more likely to substantially undershoot in their college choice. So several researchers, including myself, have documented that many of these students fail to even apply to a single institution that would fit their own academic profile. And so a lot of the effort, and this is what I'll chat briefly about today, is concentrated on students' college search and application behavior, which is very useful given the current legal environment around admissions. And so I want to talk briefly about sort of three promising practices. Two of them are very student-facing, and the third is very institution-facing. The first is direct-to-student information and advice about where to apply and what colleges to consider, paired with college application fee waivers so that they can actually take advantage of that advice. And so in this past year, the class of 2014 that just graduated recently, the College Board mailed out nearly 30,000 packets of information with customized college information to very high-achieving, low-income students about providing guidance about applying to college and financial aid. We also reached out to a number of students, 70,000 of them, with more modest academic credentials, but similarly providing them with basic guidance and college application fee waivers so they could take advantage of that guidance. There are some activities going on at the College Board around targeting students earlier in the education pipeline who are not taking advantage of the high school rigorous coursework that they have earned. And so you may have heard of the All-In campaign, which works with both educators and directly with parents to ensure that minority students who have demonstrated that they have the potential to be successful in advanced placement classes, for example, that they know that and that they are armed with the right information about how to go about approaching their school counselors and their teachers about getting into those courses. And then I'll give a nod and cede the rest of the time to the panel that these direct-to-student efforts that I've talked about that show a lot of promise and that the College Board is actively involved in need to be partnered with institutional-facing efforts. We're a membership organization, and so obviously the kinds of institution-specific activities that we've heard about today, whether they be, high school activities like, near-peer mentoring programs and other college access work, whether they be on the college side and our campus-specific programs. We've heard about the Rutgers Scholar Program, Future Scholars Program. We've heard about others like F&M's college prep program, the University of Maryland Ascent program, and some very specific, well-targeted financial aid programs like UMBC's Meyerhoff Scholarship. These are all examples of the kinds of institutional practices that really need to be partnered with the kinds of direct-to-student interventions that I described. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jessica. So on principle, I refuse to have two economists in a row, so why don't we go to Sheryll next?
Sorry.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm honored to be here. I really appreciate being included in your book party. You guys have been great for my book promotion. Thank you to my classmate, Rick Kallenberg. I've written a book that, frankly, is intentionally a polemic. I think I think the debate around affirmative action is tired, and there are a lot of ironies around the policy that bug me. One irony is that race-based affirmative action, as it is practiced in highly selective institutions, really doesn't help the vast majority of Black and Latino students in this country, most of whom will attend non-selective institutions of higher education if they go to higher education at all. Mm-hmm. Second, it tends to benefit the most advantaged of students of color, disproportionately children of immigrants, who tend to live in more integrated middle-class settings than do, for lack of a better word, native-born Black kids. And I feel like those who are blessed to come of age in poverty-free havens, who have access to highly selective K-12 education, are set up very well to enter selective higher education. But if you are outside of those networks, and by the way, only 42% of all Americans live in a middle-class neighborhood today. That's down from 65% in 1970. Only 30% of Black and Latino children live in a middle-class neighborhood today. And those who live outside of what I call the gold standard neighborhoods, everyone in this room automatically knows what kinds of neighborhoods I'm talking about. If you live outside those neighborhoods, you, as do most Black and Latino kids in this country, you have to overcome serious structural disadvantages, including under-resourced schools with less experienced teachers, fewer higher achieving peers that raise expectations and model the habits of success, and often exposure to violence. A third irony about race-based affirmative action is that it engenders resentment. White folks don't like it. And it makes it more difficult to create coherent, multiracial coalitions among the people who struggle in this country to support the public policies that will redress these serious, savage, structural barriers that most children of color face. So I argue for a series of reforms. I mean, the title of the book, shameless self-promotion, I get it out of the way, place not race. The title of the book has to do with the idea that I believe colleges and universities in this country, particularly highly selective ones, have an ethical obligation to consider, reach out to, as Nancy Cantor says, high-achieving students from under-resourced places. Every school in America has a valedictorian. Mm-hmm. I was heartened by your statistics, the idea that there are overachievers, people who are highly resilient, who overcome these structural barriers. And, the Posse Foundation has shown the average SAT scores of Posse scholars is something like 1,100, 1,150, but these kids perform. And so I think it's past time for admissions processes to begin to reflect what we know about what really counts as merit. And I argue for place in particular because, there are a lot of different strategies out there that have been discussed for a while. Class-based affirmative action. One thing that's getting trendy with admissions officers, as I understand it, is first-generation college attendance. But I don't think those kinds of things capture the structural disadvantages that are causing what I call opportunity hoarding in American society. Place, on the other hand, locks in advantages and disadvantages that are reinforced over time. Geographic separation of the classes, particularly the fluent, puts higher opportunity communities in direct competition with lower opportunity places for finite public and private resources, and affluent jurisdictions are winning. And increasingly, it's not just the affluent who are segregated into their own neighborhoods, it's highly educated people. Places that are thick with what I call college knowledge. Children like my own that grow up surrounded by doctors, lawyers, prize-winning journalists, World Bank economists, rise easily on the benefits of shared networks and practices. And interestingly, economic segregation is rising fastest among blacks and Latinos. You know, anybody who can escape equality does. And so because I see I have only 2 minutes left, I'll be quick. Among the innovations that I recommend, I was giving a leg up in admissions to any kid, high-achieving kid that comes from a neighborhood or a school where more than 20% of their peers live in poverty. I also argue that standardized tests should be optional or not used at all.
Yes.
That financial aid should be based solely on need, not so-called merit, that legacy preferences should be abolished. And as I explain in my book, my bottom line is that I think progressives who care about diversity need to begin to be overt about building alliances between struggling whites and people of color. I don't argue place as a proxy for race. I argue place for place. There are struggling people in a lot of places, and we're in a very, very bad place in this country, and until we become overt at trying to seek these alliances, I talk about the saner politics that surrounds the Texas 10% plan in my book than race-based affirmative action. I think we'll continue to get more of the same, a society that works only for people who are already advantaged. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sheryll. We'll turn next to John.
Thank you very much. I'd like to first applaud the Lumina Foundation and the Century Foundation for gathering a group of scholars, a group of researchers, some business people, civil rights advocates in Indianapolis shortly after the Fisher decision to think through the future of affirmative action. And today, that process is culminated in large part by the production of this book, The Future of Affirmative Action, New Paths to Higher Education Diversity. And I would like to next present 3 points in connection with the theme of this educational and opportunity gathering. The first is educational admissions policy, taking off right where my dear colleague Sheryll Cashin left off, to reduce the reliance on standardized tests while maintaining the quality in the admissions process and look more at the students' grade achievement. The second is a kind of civil rights litigation discussion in abandoning what is known as the Faustian bargain and to look at some possible challenges to standardized testing. And this third is somewhat provocative in terms of these new paths and new directions, as I shall explain. And so I applaud Benjamin Landy, the co-author of this chapter from the Century Foundation, for the work in trying to get at the heart of standardized tests, particularly the SAT, have long occupied a privileged position in the American educational system. And despite persistence and growing challenges to the SAT's credibility, nearly every prominent college and university requires the 4-year exam or its equivalent, the ACT. The stakes are incredibly high. For high-achieving students, good scores can open the doors to some of the world's most elite institutions, wealthy alumni networks, and prestigious job opportunities. A low score threatens to close those doors forever. The modern meritocracy is heavily invested in the belief that this system for picking talent works. After all, it worked for them. But after decades of research, the evidence against standardized testing is overwhelming. High school grades are a better predictor of college outcomes, regardless of variation in the school's quality or grading standards. And what the SAT really excels at is predicting how much money students' parents make and their level of education. And this is all brought about in what is termed a Faustian bargain by my dearly beloved sister at Harvard, Lani Guarnier. The SAT, as you know, and the College Board made yet another change to this examination, announced last March 2014. Unfortunately, even with these changes, it's likely that the test design will continue to result in a racial and socioeconomic gap, not reflective of either the student's high school achievement or predicting undergraduate success, barring thousands of otherwise qualified minority and low-income students from joining the ranks of the nation's educational elite. This is tolerated in part because defenders of affirmative action made this Faustian bargain. Quote, affirmative action was developed to compensate for the deficiencies of the new meritocracy, writes Lani Guarnier, instead of challenging the underlying assumption that there is anything intelligent about administering a 17-year-old an IQ test. Educators turn to racial preferences as a technocratic fix, obscuring the serious flaws in the meritocracy claims of a democratic opportunity. So I reach out to my civil rights advocates and say, this bargain, by the way, as Rick Kallenberg and I pointed out, also exists with respect to legacy preferences, where the defenders of affirmative action continue to support it as long as there's no challenge to legacy preferences in colleges and universities, and the same thing is existed here. So I take the opportunity of the Fisher decision and the other predictions that some have been made that the end may be near to look at other new paths. And one new path is to peel back the reliance on standardized tests and to look at grade points. And so the provocation is largely to the supporters of affirmative action to look at new challenges, and to the lawyers in the group. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund recently filed a complaint in the New York City school system challenging the testing into the select high schools of Stuyvesant and Bronx Science High Schools, with its disparate impact upon racial and language minorities as the beginning of a new wave of challenging. Rather than spending all the legal time and effort in defending affirmative action, we should look at new horizons and new opportunities to change the paradigm. I've always said in my 40 years involved in specialization in educational opportunities that I know where my legal expertise ends and what is an unequal educational opportunity under the law, and my ignorance begins on what is sound educational policy. But I am informed by my research colleagues at Berkeley and at Princeton, who have documented through the slides in this chapter that I'll spare you, but heaven forbid I stand between you and lunch. But it clearly shows that the next wave of challenge should be at the standardized test.
Thank you very much, John. So with our all-star team here, our cleanup hitter is Tony Carnevale. Tony?
That's you.
I must say, I can't resist. The last presentation takes me back. I went to work at ETS a number of years ago and recall when the Michigan case came down, we were told, essentially I was told by friends of mine that we needed to get busy because if Michigan went down, which we all assumed it would, the next thing that was coming from the civil rights movement is they come after the test. We danced around merrily for a while trying to figure a way out of that. And in the end, came up with this Strivers research, which I was involved in. And then, lo and behold, in the middle of the summer, we discovered we were going to win the case anyway. So we had to drown the Strivers work very quickly. But it was an attempt to try and do, in a lot of ways, it was the conservative solution, obviously. That is, we were doing, and I'm with you here, Jessica, I used to sit in your chair in a way. What Jessica was talking about is the most conservative solution for this, for higher education is the undermatching question, which is, we know there's a long list of research evidence. Our own numbers say that there's a good 200,000 to 300,000 kids that graduate from every high school who would have an 80% chance of graduating from a selective college. But it would reduce the test scores of the selective colleges, even though they'd hit an 85% graduation rate. It is not what we get at Georgetown, which is 96. And at other selective schools. So there is a set of solutions beyond this conversation, and I know them well. I've been bruised and bloodied by them. And I agree with just about everything that's been said here. I think the interim answers really lie with some of that is within the bounds of current institutional practice. The Jessica sorts of solution are what's available without upsetting the apple cart. In any event, the other piece of this which is interesting for me is that I've been involved in this conversation for a time, and it is a peculiar conversation, I must say, because I can't escape, and I go through this with my colleagues who tell me I'm wrong, but I can't escape the feeling that what we're trying to do and what the court at once is asking us to do is to talk about a thing without naming it. To find a solution to a problem without dealing with the problem directly. That is, how do we get racial diversity and not use race? How do we use proxies for the same purpose? It's an interesting space for a conversation in that we're forced into a certain amount of dissembling here. But in any event, having said all that, let me continue with what I think is a practice that is very American and goes back to Jefferson, I suppose, which is race is a secret we very aggressively keep from ourselves. And the court is continuing to urge us to do that. So in that spirit, let me say that I do think that is if we use race, place, and socioeconomic status, yes, we can get racial diversity. Place is a key element, I might add. Richard said a while ago that, and we've run these data, and I'll run you through them quickly, and that is that if you use race plus SES by itself, you end up getting a small decline in African American participation in the top 192 schools, albeit in our data at least there's a constraint on readiness. That is, we demand that 1,100 test scores that the posse centers around, which gives you a higher than 85% chance of graduating, by the way. We get a slight decline in African American from 4 to the current state of about 4% in our data, which is high school cohorts, from 4 to 3%, which is, I think, arguably is certainly not sufficiency. That is insufficient diversity in the end to really make a difference in a cultural sense, which is what I guess I think what we're after here is diversity for its cultural power and to some extent I would assume for its effect on economic opportunity. In that case, when we use SES, the other thing that's striking in this data and everybody who runs this data is all of these things work much better for Hispanics than they do for African Americans. That's the dirty little secret that comes up in the data over and over and over and over again. We go from roughly 7% Hispanic to 10. So in that world, you'd have 10% Hispanic in the top 192 schools and 3% African American. But where you really start to get some action is when you combine place and socioeconomic status. If you use the top 10% solution using a nationwide database, we did many runs that are not in this paper, and one of the things we know is that there's a difference between being in the top 10% nationwide and being in the top 10% one school at a time. Our data was not representative one school at a time, but to the extent we could run it, and we could run it some, it has an even more powerful effect. That does jack up the African American rate from 4 to 6%. The current 4 to 6% doesn't move Hispanics that much, takes them from 10 to 11%. And then where you really do get enormous power is if you use place, and for me that's what the 10% solution is. That is, we're saying that there is sufficient geographic concentrations such that if you use high schools the way Texas does, you're really measuring place. We can take this down to census tract and any other kind of place and get even more power when we do it. But you then really do get fairly substantial African American participation, in the top 192 goes to 10, Hispanic to 14. So there is a version of this. My own bias about it is that we probably ought to use class-based variables, SES, in the first cut. There are ways we can make them more powerful. Richard has said for a long time, and he's right, we just can't measure his view on this, and that is if we used wealth instead of earnings or family income, it would increase participation by African Americans on a whole other scale. It looks in the data like it would rise 3 to 4 times. So that version of SES alone is very powerful. I just don't know how we get to that. So in conclusion, I do think that this is doable if we can get institutions to adopt a place and class, and my own bias, race, place, and class are really the answer.
Race, place, and class. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tony. So I promised that we would have lots of time for audience conversation, so I'm going to limit myself to just one. I can't do as well as Sam did, but because I think I want to key off something Tony said and ask the panel this question about the issue of proxies. In various ways, what we're doing here is having a conversation about proxies, when, in fact, I think if you agree with what I said at the beginning, diversity is a means to an end, which is a more equitable and a more excellent system of higher education. By using proxies, are we in effect ceding, in some ways, equity and excellence to a proxy? In other words, are we actually taking the perspective that, or do we actually achieve equity and excellence by using these proxies as opposed to sticking with the perspective of race being the primary determinant here?
Well, my own bias on this is that you do water down the racial effects when you use these proxies. You're sort of cooking from 10, 20 feet out. If your purpose here is to get at race is the most obvious and easiest way to do that. So I do think that to some extent you're de-emphasizing the race agenda in the United States, and I do not. Race is alive and well in America, and I don't. So I do think that what you do end up is shifting towards class, which of course is politically much easier to do and raises possibilities for coalitions across groups and so on. But I do think you dilute
I guess my point is, when you say the race agenda, the agenda isn't race, right? The agenda is equity and excellence, isn't it? I mean, I think that's the point, and that racial diversity, the lack of racial diversity, impedes equity and impedes excellence. That's part of the challenge that we face collectively as a society. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at here is, are we using these proxy measures and therefore literally negatively impacting our ability to have a more equitable and excellent system?
Could I answer? I want to answer your question with a very brief anecdote. I teach constitutional law to first years, and last fall in my con law class, in a school that ostensibly still practices race-based affirmative action, I had 3 black students. 2 of the 3 were Nigerian, and the third was a granddaughter of a very well-known African-American federal judge, and none of them were male. And this is in a system of race-based affirmative action. And it's just an anecdote to say that I personally think affirmative action should return to its original purpose of helping people who are disadvantaged, who are locked out. And in the 21st century, in 2014, race is a very, very blunt instrument, and it does not, by definition, define who is disadvantaged and who is locked out.
Thank you. Other comments from the panel? We've got a couple of microphones in the audience. I'm hoping we can use the microphones start with Jeff.
My question for Sheryll, I really like your articulation of hoarding opportunity. And a question for you in place, you talked a bit about school quality in the K-12 sphere. Mm-hmm. So I'm really wondering how you differentiate in your book, which I have not read yet, on the problem being in K-12 rather than being college.
Right.
Going to college. So if place is a marker for underpreparing students, how do you differentiate in your focus on fixing K-12 versus using that place as an entry mechanism for post-secondary?
Well, one, the place mechanism acknowledges and brings out to the fore the underlying problem. I mean, race allows you to achieve optical diversity and get optical diversity, I mean different skin colors in the classroom, the easiest and cheapest way you can, which is to admit the most advantaged people who need the least amount of financial aid. And so it's a Band-Aid, and it actually lets universities off the hook so they don't have to do the kind of hard work that university presidents and Nancy Kerr have talked about, right? So that's the first point. So it highlights this disadvantage, but it also, again, there are high-achieving students even in under-resourced schools. You can be the valedictorian, but you're at a school that has 0 or 1 or 2 AP classes, and you're competing with people who have 20 available to them. So one, it just, at least gives kids who are high-achieving, who are willing, who have all of those the number one predictor of success in college is high school GPA. The second predictor is a willingness to do the work, to forego gratification, all these things that can be screened for. So my argument is also not just acknowledging place, but also directly confronting what is merit and having a conversation back that. And third, hopefully, and I have the last chapter of my book is entitled Reconciliation. I say throughout what we really need is a saner politics where people who are struggling coalesce, where you can get to 55% to invest in saner public policies that bring all people along. I mean, I kind of say it all along throughout the book. Really, this affirmative action that we're fighting about is beside the point. And why are we expending all this energy over a policy that helps a really narrow slice that creates and adds to the racial division rather than trying to create racial cohesion and fix the underlying problems?
Do we have a microphone in the back there? That's okay. Amber's quick.
So, Sheryll, I know that your point is about place-based, but the point about race being a blunt instrument by which to use, to do admission policy, I feel like we've been talking about SES or as a sharper instrument, and it's not necessarily so, right? We know that no matter what, SES says that African American and Latino students are closer to poverty, even if they are at a middle class line, right? Their families are generationally closer to poverty. They're more likely to have to send money home, et cetera. And so I'm just wondering, for those who have advocated for, income as a proxy, why that is seen as a sharper policy when we know that the measures that we use to determine SES are not necessarily that sharp.
I explicitly say that an income-based program is not sufficient, and I agree with you like to be called Tony?
Yes.
With Tony that wealth, low family wealth is something that also should be considered. And by the way, if colleges did consider that would in some ways also deal with the issue of place and disadvantage. I can talk about the link between place and disadvantaged low family wealth. Houses in black neighborhoods aren't as valued, that kind of thing.
One thing about this is that it really comes down to purpose, that is, vision. There is a view of this which I think is valid, which is that even affluent African Americans are disadvantaged by racial history, and that we're lucky to have them, to allow them into our elite schools, because we need examples to the world that don't fit stereotypes. So that there is a version of this in which you want to admit all the upper middle class African American students because they make for a good example. That seems to me clearly beyond the reach of our current politics. So when you mix, I think what we're capable of at the moment is mixing race and place and socioeconomic status. The concern I have about that in general is that the higher education system, in the pursuit of social goals, which is one definition of excellence, it is a definition we could have a good debate about, but higher education institutions are risk-averse to a fault, I think. That is, they won't take you in the top 192 unless you got a 1,300 score. When we know that the graduation rates of people with much lower scores are really quite good. So is the higher education system capable of reaching down and being less risk-averse? And secondly, if we switch to income, will the eventual outcome, and the cynic in me thinks this is true, will be that we'll get none of the above. That is, the financial pressures and the pressures for selectivity in higher education will disallow both race and class, because the costs and the reputational costs, not just the financial costs, of moving on a broader class-based interest is something that higher education is not capable of doing, nor have we empowered them to do it with money. That is, they're on their own, essentially.
Right, thank you. Art?
I got one, maybe more of an observation than a question, although I welcome reactions to this. Hearing this panel, and there's much that's been said I don't disagree with, but I'm concerned we're conflating two things as a matter of framing. We're talking about an indisputable national imperative around access and success, dealing with students of all backgrounds and addressing sort of the distance challenged, as you've effectively framed it. And we're overlaying that with a Supreme Court decision about the educational benefits of diversity that is very institution-specific. And it's not to say that the two aren't divorced, but I'm concerned that we're bypassing the core goals associated with diversity on a particular campus that are both mission-based and that inure to the benefit of majority and minority students, privileged and underprivileged. That's the whole theory. So it's a question of this sort of alignment in how these two sets of issues, I think, relate to each other.
Thank you, Art. Anybody want to comment on that question of alignment?
Well, between the educational benefits of diversity and helping kids who live with segregation every day, my passion is with the latter, right? I just see increasing, I am poking my finger in the eye of elite education in my book. I see a very unjust society that's getting worse, and increasingly elite higher education being the playground of people who are already elite. So, and as to middle-class black folks, one of the things that also concerns me a little bit about race-based affirmation, what you say, kind of assumes that a middle-class black person who has opportunity can't meet the standards, and I just don't buy that. I'm surrounded by black families with high-achieving black kids, and I believe we can compete, and I tell my kids every day, who are so privileged I can barely stand them, that,
Your twins.
My twins, twin 7-year-olds, that, if you don't want to work hard, if you don't want to take, 5, 6, 7 AP classes, don't be upset when that Ghanaian immigrant takes your place, because that's what's happening now, But I do believe middle-class black kids can compete, and most of them will be fine. They're going to land somewhere. They're going to land somewhere, but most black and Latino kids are not fine today. What American society is giving them is a raw, immoral deal. And for me, that's more important than diversity.
Thanks, Sheryl. Matt?
So I don't work for the College Board, but on behalf of my psychometrician brothers, I have to stand up a little bit for the SAT. And because it strikes me as also plausible that the SAT should sort of be correlated with socioeconomic indicators, should reflect socioeconomic inequalities, widening inequalities in America, the same way that grades do. Grades are also correlated with socioeconomic status, just not quite as highly as SAT scores. So I wonder if, and this is really a question for John, if you would be amenable to something like Tony was talking about, the Strivers program, where you actually view grades and SAT scores in light of the socioeconomic characteristics that influence those measures. So, you know, given where this kid comes from in both an SES and a place perspective, how much above or below other students' SAT scores is this kid landing? I know that sounds like a plug for the overachievement index, but that's because it is. So,
Thank you very much. Yes, I would be open to further exploring it. I also would like to at least see more pilot experimentation with Wake Forest University's system of test option of the student to submit tests or not, and to see how they fare in the admissions process with the other criteria. Sometimes it's called don't ask, don't tell, not in the military exclusion of gays, but don't ask me my SAT score, and I won't tell you, and let's see how I come out.
And actually, for the subversive admissions officers, if you make your SAT, if you go to SAT optional, you might actually rise in the U.S. News Report rankings. You know, I point that out to colleges all the time.
There is some research on that topic as well. Yes.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. My name's Nancy Leopold. I run a college access and success program up the road a little bit in Montgomery County. I also went to way too many of the highly selective institutions that we're talking about. So I know it from both sides, and I think there are at least two false assumptions that we need to unmask. One is that via SAT or any other route, that it's easy to tell which kids are going to succeed in college. We work with over 300 seniors every year, and some of the kids who do the best are the ones with some of the worst scores. We have kids who come from other countries and their GPAs are recalculated by the overburdened international department in our school system that assigns a Ghanaian, 1 to 9 system, 9 being an A, and of course that's walks on water, and they don't give any of those. Anyway, you have kids who are A students being labeled as B or worse. So you look at these numbers, even if you're looking at GPAs, which we all know are much more reliable. Sorry, I just have to say that on the ground, the SAT and the ACT are terrible indicators of what the kids we serve can do. And it is only the colleges that are missing out. Now, so the notion that we can tell, I love the concept of an overachievement index, but I think we got to be very careful about how we measure that, because there's so many kids with so many circumstances that are just not well captured in those numbers. Secondly, I think we have to get over the notion that the selective institutions care about diversifying, whether it's by race or class. Exactly. I haven't identified any of mine because I sit on a diversity committee of one of them. So I wouldn't be able to tell you this, but I will tell you that when we hear from the admissions office, the dean of admissions, what we're told is that they are absolutely accepting all of the low income and underrepresented minority students that they can find, who are, of course, qualified. Now, I've never heard from them, and I run such an organization, but we won't even go there to the implementation issues. There really is this very fundamental notion that they are doing absolutely everything they can, and it gets them to about the middle of the pack on, Pell, whatever number you use, and that's really good, because the other thing we have to accept is that international students from foreign lands who can pay are also being recruited. And so we used to lament the legacy, the athlete slots, the et cetera. We're not even calculating the decrease in actual slots available to the kids, that I serve in my program and that we all care about. So I don't think it's going to happen there. I think we should be working at other levels and let them finally figure out that even all the rich white people don't only want to go to school with rich white people. But ultimately, I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, go ahead.
Another thing that I failed to mention, but is in my book, that's very, very important for colleges that are sincere about wanting to get real diversity of all kinds and flavors, is working with an organization like Posse, like Questbridge, that is very good at finding high-achieving kids from overlooked places. They have an expertise at figuring this out. And, Posse is more selective than Harvard. Only like 4.5% of applicants get a Posse scholarship. So if you're really worried about that, working with a partner organization can help a lot to help you find the strivers that are there.
Jessica?
At the risk of sounding defensive,
That's all right, Jess. We love you, young lady.
I actually didn't come here to defend the SAT, but and so thank you to my psychometrician colleague, but I sort of feel compelled to say that the predictive validity of the SAT has been very, very well established by dozens and dozens of studies by psychometricians, and that's not to refute your personal experiences with the students that you serve. But it's simply to reiterate that for the vast majority of colleges and universities, that is a crucial part of the admissions process, and that the College Board has only ever advocated that the SAT be used in conjunction with a whole host of other measures that capture the whole child. And so these are some of the non-cognitive things that you simply mentioned. There are things like high school GPA, but I would just sort of caution the audience that all tests are not immune to the kinds of things that seem to be directed just at my organization's test.
Yeah, I would agree with that in the main. That is, the SAT has a level of statistical validity. You can contest it downward. I think we're talking 42% of variance explained. I would argue you can drive that down towards 30 in a variety of ways. And the other difficulty here, which doesn't mean the SAT doesn't measure well, is that in the end, you'll get the same distribution no matter which test you use. So whether it's an achievement test or whatever the SAT is, the SAT measures this thing called G, and the only way to explain G to people is G is G and there is no G but G. There is it really, we don't know what it measures. But in the end, in the end, my bias would be a modest proposal was cut off the scoring at 1100. And then, because the issue, I think, is that the selective system overuses the SAT to reduce risk to the point where I think it's not socially productive. You don't need a 96% graduation rate, truthfully, if your goal is to serve broader social purposes. You can live with an 85% graduation rate. But the way the current system of higher education is structured, they absolutely cannot live with an 85% graduation rate, nor can they afford the kinds of kids that we're talking about. Once you get past Harvard and Yale and a few other places, nobody can afford low-income kids. They cost too much money.
Let me ask John to jump in here really quickly. I want to try to get to two more questions, but let me ask John to jump in on that.
Yeah. Real quick, Tony and Jessica, I do agree with you on that part of the validation of the SAT. The question is, how can you get the users of your product to follow your advice not to heavily rely upon the scores? And we are faced with this point that Sheryll alluded to, the so-called 900-pound gorilla in the room, and that's the U.S. News World Report rankings.
Exactly.
And so it's a kind of self-fulfilling cycle that I don't want to do it. I don't have to rely on it. And as we know at admissions, I'm looking at the highest score, and the person is dull as ditch water, as we used to say, on admissions. But if we admit that person, it's really going to run our rankings up. And so they kind of hold their nose and admit them. but they disregard the admonition and not to place so much emphasis on these tests. How do we convey and ensure that compliance? Jessica?
That's a wonderful question, and I happen to have two colleagues in the room that are much better suited to answer that because of the positions that they have been in with regard to being admissions folks. So I would like to turn it over to Magan or Brad for either of you to talk about, working with college admissions officers and the way in which they utilize that information. Yeah. Not to deflect, but there's more expertise.
So I don't work for the SAT or the College Board. I happen to be chairman of the Board of Trustees. So there's no pay there. Let me go to the point about admissions, though. An admissions officer worth her or his salt does not use the SAT or the ACT as the sole variant for admissions process. We understand there are many, many more variables. So that's a point that needs to be well taken. Whether you think of the statistical methods and the calculations of going up or down, this is simply one quiver or one arrow in the quiver of the admissions process. The other thing is this. If one thinks of the SAT or the ACT, which has also changed its examination, as in fact an assessment, then let's go back to every classroom that you've been into. If you have been a student, that's rhetorical, you understand that no teacher worth her or his salt is delivering the same examination day in and day out. Assessments change. They must change. They have to change with the basic demographic trends that we see. So that's the point I would want to make about the SAT and any other assessment, right? And I agree wholeheartedly that our country at this very moment is awash and drowning in assessments. And we need to do something about that. I'd like to address something else, though, that I find as disturbing in this discussion, and Professor Cashin has pointed to it to some degree. If we're thinking about policy directives, the question that I have to ask about the new demographic wave that is sweeping this country and that's going to shape it over the next few decades is, how are we understanding how we are to educate those students who are going to come in the next 2 decades? And they are not going to be at 200 elite institutions.
Absolutely.
Right.
So here, for the economists who are sitting on the panel, for those of you who are in the audience, I want to direct your attention to political economy. Something that talks to the question of how one, in fact, thinks about access to the distribution and control of resources. That's where the game is. I also want to ask that people think about maybe new conceptual parameters. Conceptually, strategically, tactically, we have been unable to anticipate that we are in a protracted struggle. And race is only one face of that struggle. When I heard the question about proxy, whether or not something was being used as a proxy, that takes me back to political economy. The question becomes, how do we understand race as a constituent element of class in terms of thinking about how we distribute resources? In the same way we might think about gender, or even sexual preference, or age. They're all there. And so those become key elements in terms of thinking about how we move forward in terms of policy decisions. It's also incumbent that we not be ahistorical in the approach to affirmative action and the way in which it morphs. Jefferson, when he in fact penned those words in the Declaration of Independence, was talking about acting affirmatively for a class that he represented. This is not a racial issue. This is as old as the history of the United States. And we need to understand that people are going to attempt to affirm what they believe is theirs and to act upon it. And they're going to use different elements to do that. And to think that we can contend on the basis of simply race alone is going to leave us locked out of a number of strategic positions that we need to take.
Thank you very much. Very, very well said. Very, very useful. I want to. We ripped the microphone out of somebody's hand, and at the risk of incurring Mercedes' wrath here, I want to get to that question since we are very close to our end here.
My question is actually it's actually a question very close to what we just heard, and that's we've been talking an awful lot in ways that essentially, in the way I've been thinking about it, the pernicious act of academic profiling. And what I'd like to get to is where I think you started us, Jamie, which was identifying the challenge and the potential problems we face as a nation as being huge. And a lot of the discussion today, I think, has focused on what amount to thimbles full of solution rather than buckets, the buckets that we need. So I guess my question to the panel is, how do we achieve scale?
Well, I don't think you achieve scale through any affirmative action program that's focused on selective higher education. You achieve scale on the ground by building multiracial majorities that get to 55% to change a policy course in a state legislature. In my final chapter of the book, I hold up examples of multiracial coalitions that did just that moved a policy course to a fairer direction, that led to a fairer distribution of resources, and the multiracial coalitions included some white Republicans. Poverty is growing fastest in the suburbs. There are a lot of formerly middle class, majority white communities that are distressed, that are changing rapidly, that are experiencing a lot of the same kind of problems that we often associate with inner cities. And, people who on the ground need to be overt about building alliances among the people who represent them. And some organizations have been successful at doing that. And so I talk about the theory and mechanics of multiracial coalition building to get us to a saner politics.
I guess I would quickly respond by saying that one way to build scale is to make a part of our business as usual sort of free-flowing information to places where it's not currently getting, right? So, and what I mean by that is information that reaches younger students and their families, that communicates as early as we can as much information about their academic potential and the opportunities that they have available to them as soon as we can, because that influences their goals. It influences how far they strive. And so, conveying that information, not just through test scores, but that's part of it. Also accurately conveying information about how much it costs to go to college for people like them, right? That's something that we know that misperceptions over the net price that many students would pay changes people's exploration and application behavior in ways that sort of shut doors rather than open them. So I would say that the things that are the most scalable are those things that change the premise upon which people make very important decisions, and that's information.
John's going to close us out here.
I would quickly say that on the political side, one of the most inadvertent successful coalition building educational tools for diversity is the Top 10% plan in Texas. Though created, as we heard, in reaction to nullifying the affirmative action plan in Texas at the time in the Hopwood decision, it has produced the most support among rich and poor, high-achieving, low-achieving, all racial and ethnic groups in Texas. And as one example in the Fisher case, as one of the ones in the lead team, Greg Abbott, the Attorney General, now running for governor, Rick Perry, the governor, most red-beaked Republicans you can find, and vertically all the way down the line to the NAACP Legal Defense and Mexican-American Fund, have been in total agreement in support of affirmative action. And the test of my thesis is that about 4 or 5 years after the program was started in 1996, 97, 98, it went into effect. And following the affirmative action in the Grutter and Gratz cases in 2003, the legislators sought to repeal the top 10% plan, and they couldn't. They were stopped dead in their tracks with hordes of support from all those districts that tasted for the first time, as someone said, sending their children to the University of Texas, and they had never experienced that before, and they weren't about to lose it afterwards.
Please join me in thanking our very insightful panel.